taking over from Whale, who's done an excellent job as host. So first of all, thank you very much, Whale, for facilitating and hosting and doing all the intros and stuff like that, and keeping us all on track. And yes, on to the next session. It's an absolute pleasure and delight to announce Joe Griffin about to talk. We've actually met a couple of times, and I've seen you do a lot of content on LinkedIn and stuff like that. You share a lot of knowledge in the community, so it's an absolute pleasure to have you here. You're also a director, so and today you'll be talking about to flow or not to flow, ALM considerations and approaches for Power Automate and Azure Logic Apps. Please kick off, Joe. Thank you very much.
Wow, what an introduction. Thank you, David. Okay,
No
great. Yeah, so really pleased to be with you here today. So before we kick off, just a big thank you to the sponsors for today's event, which we can see on the slide down here. We thank them for obviously supporting this event. Without their support, we couldn't be here today sort of presenting. So do please check out what they're offering, what they're all about, as a way of sort of thanking them for their support today. So we're going to move on, and let me just get on to the next slide. So as David has said already, today we're going to be talking about Power Automate and Logic Apps, and we're going to be hopefully trying to answer the question, do we want to flow or not to flow when it comes to using one or the other tools, particularly when we are looking to adopt a really sort of healthy automated ALM process with our particular Power Platform solution. So just kick off with just a few details about myself. We'll also just cover off, okay, well, what are we actually talking about today? It may be that you've never heard of Logic Apps before. It may be you're just not too sure in terms of what we mean by Cloudflow. So we'll cover that off first of all. We'll also talk about, okay, what do we actually mean by ALM? What are we trying to sort of achieve with that? And then we'll jump in and look at what I've termed the sort of the good, the bad, the ugly when it comes to our Cloudflows and our Logic Apps. We'll have a demonstration to hopefully show some things off with there. And then we'll close off and hopefully have some time for a bit of a Q&A session towards the end. But please, as the session is going through, I've got the two screens open on here, so please do ask your questions in the chat, and I'll try and just sort of get things answered as we go along. Want to have a good, healthy discussion today if we can. So yeah, David's already touched on this a little bit already, but yeah, hi, my name is Joe Griffin. I am Managing Director of Solar Cloud Solutions, a Microsoft Gold partner based in the sort of northwest of the UK. So I spend a lot of my time sort of consulting and advising technically when it comes to the sort of the core business applications lineup, with a particular focus towards Power Platform, the customer engagement applications, and also Microsoft Azure as well. I'm involved as part of different events and also as part of the Manchester user group, where we're hoping to have our next in-person event very soon. So please keep an eye out for that. So yeah, as I say, I work very technically when it comes to the platform. So experience working with C#, .NET, SQL Server. And in terms of the customers and clients that we're working with at the moment at Solo, it's everything from companies with 2 to 3 employees, right through to sort of global organizations. And again, really just advising and consulting about how we can best leverage these technologies and really providing that sort of technical consultancy and expertise where relevant. Okay, so let's first of all talk about what we are going to be looking at today and look at Cloudflows first of all. So hopefully you know what these are already, but if not, then these are our primary sort of automation tools that we can leverage within the Power Platform. So whether we're looking to do sort of personal productivity sort of automations, maybe do something like go through our email inbox, download all attachments, then save them onto OneDrive, or if we're looking to implement more advanced automation scenarios where we're trying to sort of get our different systems integrated together. So whenever maybe a new Dataverse row is created, we want to go off into our SQL database or into maybe our Salesforce system and do something. Power Automate can support all of these different scenarios sort of end to end. And we've also got lots of nice things out of the box that we can leverage, which we'll touch upon in a bit more detail in a few moments, things like the approval engine. And we've got nice support for being able to leverage our Cloudflows regardless of where our sort of technical stack exists. So if we're on the cloud, great, we can work with our cloud systems, our cloud SaaS products, or if we're still on premise, we can very quickly and easily connect up to those environments using the on-premise data gateway. Now, Logic Apps, by comparison, are very similar, and we're going to touch upon that on why that is in a few moments. And what we've got here is a more sort of advanced sort of, I guess, enterprise automation solution that we can turn to. So really, it will achieve the same sort of, and we can achieve the same sort of aims with our Logic Apps compared to our Cloudflows. Logic Apps go a little bit further by having support for more advanced features. So, for example, if we are looking to migrate away from BizTalk, we've got a range of different APIs that are available in Logic Apps that can help ease our migration, towards the cloud a bit more easily. And the main benefit that our Logic Apps gives us compared to our Cloudflows is that we can get in to the actual underlying code, and fiddle away with it to our heart's content. With our Cloudflows, we're really encouraged to use that sort of designer process, which is great for our citizen developers, great for those who are maybe not too familiar with working with code. They can go in and build out their flows very easily. But if we're wanting to maybe do some slightly more complex things, slightly more interesting things when it comes to maybe parameterization and things like that, with Logic Apps, we've got the ability of being able to do that. We can go in at any time. We can see we've got the option there, code view, go in, make some amends, and those will then be reflected as part of our solution. So this slide here gives us a bit of a summary in terms of what the key differences are. So Power Automate is a software as a service product. As part of that, we are typically maybe consuming that as part of a license. It could be that maybe we have got a Dynamics 365 customer engagement license that includes usage rights for that. It could be that we've purchased a license that gives us 10,000 runs per month or something like that. Various different ways in which we can sort of consume that with the expectation that we've got predictable cost around that. Logic Apps, by comparison, are more of a sort of a platform as a service type offering. And here we're being paid based on usage. So the more we use, the more we're going to pay potentially. So potentially quite nice if we've got low usage scenarios, and in fact we get a dedicated amount of credits included or runs included per month for our Logic Apps, potentially meaning that we can run it for free. But as we start to get into those heavy duty scenarios, it's going to cost us quite a bit more. As we touched upon already, we can get a bit more hands-on with the code with our Logic Apps, and we can use tools such as Visual Studio or the Online Designer to build and write those. So if we're coming from more of a pro developer background, then it might be we're going to have a nicer time with our Logic Apps. One important difference between our Power Automate and Logic Apps is that when it comes to Dataverse, we've got this concept of the current environment connector in Power Automate, which, as the name implies, will always ensure that we are connecting to the correct Dataverse environment based on where our flow resides. So if we're in our production environment, our flow is going to look at production. If we're in test, it's going to look at test, etc., etc. Logic Apps, by comparison, doesn't have this concept of the current environment connector. Indeed, at the moment, the only connector that you've got on there is the one that is actually marked as a legacy at the moment. So what developers must do as part of that is, state very clearly, okay, this is the Dataverse environment that we want to connect to. It's not going to be able to go in and understand what environments we've got, or indeed align to a current environment, because from an Azure standpoint, we don't have the concept of environments there. We've got concepts of resource groups and things like that instead. As I touched upon a few moments ago, Power Automate gives us this really nice approval automation engine that we can use sort of out of the box. So if we're wanting to implement very simple or complex approval scenarios, we can do that very easily in Power Automate. These capabilities are not available in Logic Apps, and we would have to build them out bespoke. We've already talked about the ways in which we can charge for our different Power Automate and Logic Apps. And Power Automate has the concept of connection references and environment variables, which is something that we're going to return to in a short while. Whereas our Logic Apps instead maybe are a bit better in the sense that we've got more richer parameterization capabilities. And as part of that, we would typically use either an Azure RM, resource manager template, or if we are looking to work on the more sort of bleeding edge of Azure, we'd maybe look to create a bicep template instead. So hopefully that explains some of the key differences between both of these tools. So when it comes to and as you may have seen in the screenshots, hang on, these tools look fairly similar. Is there actually much difference with them? Well, actually, our Power Automate Cloudflows are effectively just Logic Apps behind the scenes. Whenever we create a new Cloudflow, it's going off behind the scenes and creating a Logic app. The key difference with that is that we're not getting the full experience exposed out to us. But the benefit of that is that when we're maybe looking at scenarios where we're wanting to use maybe Cloudflows and Logic Apps sort of interchangeably, we can be assured that we've got the same set of connectors for the most part, the same authoring experience. We can go into the portal and use this designer. And both of these will also support the on-premise gateway that I spoke about a few moments ago. Now, same connectors as we touched upon already. So the current environment connector for Dataverse isn't available for Logic Apps. Likewise, there are some more sort of advanced connector types that aren't available in Power Automate that do things like XML, JSON validation and parsing and things like that. If we wanted to leverage those, we need to go off into our Logic Apps. At any time, if we wanted to, we can look to, I guess, promote our Cloudflows into a Logic app. We've got the ability of being able to export the underlying template for our flow into a Logic app template that we can then import into Azure and then set up accordingly. The key caveat with that is that we just need to make sure that we're using a supported set of connectors. So if we were to, for example, try and export a flow that's using the Dataverse current environment connector, then we're going to find that we're not going to be able to do that. And we can also work interchangeably. So maybe we could have a Cloudflow that calls a Logic app, a Power app that calls a Logic app, or even vice versa as well. So we've got some potentially fun scenarios that we could look to set up, and potentially a Cloudflow and a Logic app could be good bedfellows depending on the type of scenario that we're working with. So it raises a bit of a natural question at this point. Okay, well, which tool should we be using then? If they are broadly the same, then which is going to be best for a particular scenario? So here's what I think is what you would see term as maybe the official guidance, what Microsoft would advise you. So for Cloudflows, definitely if you're in a situation where you've got citizen developers in your organizations, where you've got those very sort of simple or maybe semi-complex integrations that you want in, and where you're working very closely with Microsoft Dataverse and need to be able to sort of benefit from the current environment connector, then these will be our sort of good scenarios where we can use our Cloudflows. And we can very easily and quickly get these into the hands of our citizen developers or our functional consultants, and they can set these up with minimal barriers within our particular environments. Logic Apps will be more for those situations where we're wanting to do a bit of sort of pro code or maybe fusion extensibility. Maybe we're in situations where we've got workflows that are executing quite sort of rapidly, where we need to leverage those more advanced connector options that we spoke about. There'll also be situations where maybe we need to have better control and better monitoring of our particular automation. So if we need to be able to have access to logs going back over 30 days, or if we need to export out logs from our Cloudflows into something like Azure Monitor or something like that, then at the moment, Logic Apps is going to be the only option that we can consider there. So hopefully that helps sort of set in your mind, okay, well, what should we be recommending or what should we be going down based on the scenario that we're looking at? So that gets us half the way, but and in theory it all sounds good, but we have got a bit of an issue here, and I'm interested to hear what other people's thoughts are in the chat about this. If you have got experience of this, the key issue seems to be that when we're looking to do that full nice automation using Azure DevOps, we're trying to get our Cloudflows deployed out, into multiple environments. It's not really a great experience. It tends to be a case that we can't just get it working, or even if we find a way to get it working, it typically involves us having to write a lot of different sort of custom script. A lot of manual intervention is required as part of that, and it's not going to be as nice to deploy a Cloudflow out compared to a Logic app. And this is the argument that I'm potentially going to be making to you today. And again, I'm really interested to hear in the chat what your own thoughts are on this and whether you agree or disagree. It could be maybe I'm just a big dummy. I've been banging my head against this for too long and I'm missing something obvious. But certainly this is the feeling that I get today when it comes to our Cloudflows. So, what we're trying to do with our ALM, or our application lifecycle management process ultimately is achieve these key aims that we can see on the slide here. We want to ensure that we've got really sort of nice, consistent deployments that we can repeat. We can give the business the assurance that, when we do a deployment into sort of production, it's going to stick first time. We're not going to be having to go in after the fact, fix a load of issues, not going to have a load of different errors and stuff like that. And really, it starts to get us, our particular sort of Power Platform solution feeling very sort of mature. And with that maturity, we can manage it a lot better. Now, this is not necessarily going to be a one-size-fits-all approach. So typically maybe investing heavily, particularly when it comes to automated application lifecycle management for a smaller organization, it might not be the best fit. And over time, things can get particularly sort of complex. But what I would say with that is, don't forget the old acronym KISS. Keep it simple, stupid. ALM. If you're doing it right, it should be achieving a very specific purpose, and you should be trying to reduce complexity where possible. And that's going to help us hopefully to assure that our deployments will always complete, and we'll have that that sort of bulletproof sort of assurance each time. So a lot of the theory when it comes to ALM, and in particular ALM with DevOps and the Power Platform, this is what we talk about, what Microsoft talk about wanting to provide to our Power Platform sort of solutions and deployments. The aim is we want to try and ensure that we are able to get started very quickly. So it's not going to take us a day and an age to set up a new environment. It's not going to be a massive issue to get integrated alongside DevOps or our source control systems. It should be an easy process. When it comes to our builds, when it comes to the tooling around that, we should be able to embrace this very, very easily. It's going to be quick and easy for us to create, for example, a build pipeline in DevOps, use a couple of different action steps, and then from there we've got our full deployment process mapped out. As part of that, we want to ensure that we've got this repeatable and predictable deployment methodology. It should be getting to a point where at any point we can just reset, for example, our development environments. We can run a DevOps pipeline and everything should be restored to how we need it to be. And that's what it should be, as easy as that. And around that, when it comes to the management capabilities around, for example, our environments, all of that should be a really nice experience. So for example, we should be able to easily create a new Dataverse environment. We should be able to back that up easily. We should be able to reset it if we needed to. All of this shouldn't be a massive hassle to set up. And finally, at the back end of this, what we expect, or what we hope to get to, is that there'll be this really consistent and valuable telemetry that we can access across all of our different deployments, all of our different environments. So again, we can start to sort of close that feedback loop, and we can start to really understand the health of our particular solution deployments and ensure that we are taking proactive action where necessary to resolve or fix any problems or issues. And all of this, as the theory states, is powered by the set of tools that we get provided to us by Microsoft. These are the sort of the Power Platform build tools. So as part of this, we should be able to achieve everything that we can see on the slide on here. All of this can be built out very easily in Azure DevOps. And we can see we can do a variety of things, from exporting solutions through to unpacking them, automating our unit tests, running things like the solution checker, parsing those results, and then maybe creating new work items from it. A whole host of different things that we can do. So this is what we are sort of promised. This is the sort of what we read about when it comes to ALM, DevOps, and the Power Platform. The reality, though, I don't know. And again, I'm interested to hear others' thoughts on this. The reality does feel a little bit different. In practice, it does not quite up to there. And I think it's something that Microsoft themselves, recognise it is, and it is a very serious and very huge area of investment by Microsoft, at the moment, and we're seeing all the time new features, new capabilities coming out. What we can potentially infer from that is that maybe there's a recognition that things are just not quite up to scratch. There's work that needs to be done to get us to a much better sort of state of play. What it also feels like as well is that, okay, all this stuff reads good. We can read the documentation, it all sounds good, but then when we get out into the field, when we start to implement all of this, issues just crop up all the time. And again, as I said earlier, this could be down to me just being a big dummy, stupidity. I'm interested to hear thoughts on this, or it could just be a case that, we're just not there yet. And again, there's additional work needed. And, what that means is that, instead, what we have to look at doing instead is look at writing out custom authored solutions to achieve things that, when you think about it, well, hang on, this should be really easy to do. So a good case of this is that when it comes to trying to deploy our flows cleanly, at the moment, you need to look at writing some form of custom scripting to be able to sort of achieve that. and a link on here to a particular blog post that the amazing Scott Duro published a while back, which again helps us to mind the gap with a particular issue at the moment when it comes to connection references. But the main issue with this is that we're having to go in and write PowerShell script to be able to sort of achieve something that you feel, this should just work out the box type stuff. So this is what it feels like very much to me in practice at the moment when it comes to the automation and particularly ALM and DevOps in the Power Platform. So why is this all important, and why should this, and when it comes to our Logic Apps and Cloudflare, why is this such an important consideration? Well, we want to be automating as much as possible. If we're working with these quite sort of large deployments where we're looking to, work in an agile fashion, pushing out updates very frequently, if we're not automating, a large part of this, then we're going to be seeing some real significant pressure points emerge over time. The key thing from Microsoft's standpoint as well is that over time we're moving away from this, what we term maybe this environment-centric approach, more to a source control centric approach. So as I mentioned earlier, we need to be getting and working towards an approach that that ensures that our environments from a dev test point of view are ultimately disposable, and we can very quickly and easily restore or recreate a particular environment based on what we've got in source control. So therefore, over time, automation is going to become more important as we move to this different sort of mindset. And having a good, healthy ALM process will ensure that we've got no barriers and no friction towards getting us into there. When it comes in addition as well, we want to have that certainty that a deployment will succeed. We want to know that when it hits production, that it's not going to be, have a massive error, or we're not going to get behavior that we don't expect each time. We've hopefully ironed that out, through our deployments to test and UAT and things like that. And the ultimate upside as well from that is that we can then avoid those situations. I think we've probably all been there at some point in our lives where we're trying for the 16th time to get something into production, at 11 o'clock on a Friday evening, and sacrificing our weekends and our evenings in the process. So, ideally, if we've got this all right, if this is all working as we want it to, then, we can do more interesting things with our evenings, by putting our feet up, maybe learn a bit more about the Power Platform, just give our our weekends and our sanity back to us in some shape or format. So let's start to break it down a little bit now then and look at, okay, when it comes to our Cloudflares and Logic Apps, how do they compare from an ALM standpoint? And can we sort of try and find what's good about them, what's maybe not so good, and the things that, that could cause us some anguish or some frustration? And then we'll do a demonstration at the back end just to show you some of this, some of these concepts in a bit more detail. So Cloudflares then, first of all. So what can we say is good about them? Well, we've got some really healthy and nice support now for things like our environment variables. So when we go into any one of our Cloudflares, when we open up the dynamic pane on the right-hand side, we can see that all environment variables in the solution in our particular environment are available to us. So it becomes very quick and easy for us to add these and incorporate these within our flows for as and when the need arises. As I mentioned earlier, the current environment connector is pretty invaluable. So if we're working with flows that are, solely focused on Dataverse, it's actually really nice and easy to get these pushed out. We know that, when it goes into test, it's going to look at our test Dataverse, it's going to look at our production Dataverse. There's no additional config required as part of this. So that takes a bit of a load off there for us. And also as well, our Cloudflares now sit very nicely alongside our solutions. Previously in the early days of our flows, similar to our Canvas apps, we may have to export them out as a package and then import them in. As part of that, we don't have that nice ALM going on, but now we can incorporate them as part of our solutions. We can extract them out, we can store them in source control, and it all works really nicely from a from that particular ALM standpoint. So these are some of the good things that we can probably say about our flows today. The bad things, so the first one maybe depends on the type of audience you are, but certainly if you are maybe a pro code or a Fusion developer, the fact that you've maybe not got any sort of IDE support, support for things like Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code could be a little bit sort of frustrating. There is nothing stopping you from maybe going in and making some changes to the underlying JSON when you extract out a solution. So when you export the solution out, when you expand it out, what you'll notice is that each of your flows will have a corresponding JSON document. You could edit that if you wanted to. I probably wouldn't advise against it. And in fact, I do believe it's probably an unsupported step. So again, just use that at your own peril. Our flows have, I guess, what we term our basic logging and monitoring capability. So this covers things like, only a 30-day retention on our previous runs. We can't look to integrate it alongside more enhanced sort of monitoring and logging solutions. So potentially, if we're wanting to, manage our flows, maybe from a more formal standpoint, we could hit some barriers there. Also at the moment as well, some components, some features which you could argue are pretty essential from an ALM standpoint are still in sort of preview. And preview features, as we're regularly told, they're not something that are generally advised for production. So things like, so good things like, support for settings, things like support for Azure Key Vault integration. These are all really great things, but it's perhaps questionable whether or not we're actually safe to start using these until they're out into general availability, because there could be maybe things change or things are altered and things like that. Okay, so now we move on to the ugly. So my main bugbear at the moment, seeing pretty much every day, the connections, and in particular user-owned connections. So whenever you set up a new flow in an environment, you have to set up a connection. That's all fine. The problem is that connection is typically owned by an individual user in the organization. It's not something that can be shared out with users. And if it's a case that we then try and import in a flow as a different user, so if we're working as part of a larger team, we've got multiple people doing our deployments, there's a really good chance that our flows will then break following following our import action, because it's not able to find and locate the existing connection that's been set up. So the typical experience that I find is that, whenever we're deploying out flows, for example, from a DevOps pipeline, it's always a case that you have to go in after the fact and fix the flows manually to get them working. And we'll come back to why that's such a problem in a few moments. With our flows, Big Brother, or in this case, Microsoft, is watching constantly. So they do actually go in and take proactive action against flows that may be causing problems. Now, this is not necessarily a bad thing, perhaps, but we do have to be aware that, if, for example, our flow is constantly failing, if our flow, if something goes on behind the scenes, then potentially Microsoft will take action to go in and disable that flow. We'll always get notified after the fact, but we also perhaps maybe don't have that same level of control over our particular integration compared to alternate options such as our Logic Apps. Licensing is always a fun topic, and for flows, things can start to get maybe a bit more sort of confusing over time. When you compare it to the Logic Apps, it's going to be a bit more harder to maybe explain, okay, how much do things cost? What do we need to pay for each month? Things like that become a bit of a nightmare to sort of go through. And then we've got what we call this unmanaged layer hell. So if we go back to the other scenario where maybe, we've imported in our flows, they've been switched off, or there's a problem with them because maybe there's a different user-owned connection. We go into that particular environment, we fix the flow. Guess what you've just done? You've just added an unmanaged layer onto your flow. When you then go in and then maybe make a change to that flow in the future, you then push out again a new managed version, your new changes aren't going to surface because that unmanaged layer is taking precedent over any managed customizations that you've made. So that's fine. Okay, let's go in, let's remove the unmanaged layer. Oh, but then what's happened? Your flow has broken again because the user-owned connection is different. So again, you fix it and you're back to square one. And you just got this constant sort of cycle. Each time you do a deployment, you're having to go in, fix the flow, and then do this each time. It's not nice. The whole point of hopefully, trying to adopt ALM and trying to automate it is that we want to avoid this situation where we're going in and doing these manual amends. So this is a particular bugbear of mine. Again, I'm keen to hear in the chat if anyone has any ways in which you can sort of get around this thing, but it does seem to be a bit of an issue when it comes to using flows and using DevOps to automate our deployments. It's not a problem if maybe we are looking to deploy manually, or if it's the same user each time who's doing the deployment. There things seem to work quite well, and indeed for certain projects that I've been involved in, this is the standpoint that we've taken. We've had to set up, for example, a dedicated service account. That service account is then used for every solution deployment that we do for flows, and we always do that manually to avoid these type of issues from emerging. So yeah, so some things there which, again, bugbears of mine, which can harm us a bit when it comes to ALM automation and our cloud flows. let's move on now and look at our Logic Apps. Then, so what can we say is good about these then? It's actually pretty easy to actually get started with our Logic Apps. So if maybe we're using our cloud flows, we can very easily look to migrate those across into Logic Apps. It's not going to be too difficult, provided we're using supported set of connectors. As I mentioned earlier, we've got support for more advanced capabilities. So if we're doing things like XML, validation and transformation, we're wanting to use liquid operations. So that's a fun fact for you. Did you know that even Logic Apps support liquid templating, and you can do things here like conversions and stuff like that. So it's not just a Power Apps portals feature. As part of our Logic Apps, we can have full control over the underlying workflow definition of the code. We've got access to more enhanced logging capabilities. So Logic App runs will be stored for more than 30 days. We can hook up to Azure Monitor or Log Analytics and actually really understand what's going on with our Logic Apps. And we've also got support for these managed identities as well. And this really helps a lot when it comes to maybe looking to avoid situations where we're having to store credentials. So what we can do, for example, is that we can set up a managed identity for our Logic App. That managed identity can then be given permissions across things like Azure SQL, Azure Storage accounts, other different things as well. All of this can actually really help us and stuff like that. And that's not something that we've got as part of our cloud flows at the moment, and can harm us on there. Okay, I can see a few questions in the chat about connection references, potentially helping with the user own connection issue. Yeah, so we use connection references quite a lot. Again, maybe I'm just doing something wrong or something really obviously sort of incorrect, but even with connection references involved, we still have problems with these user own connections. It just doesn't seem to resolve it. Again, and maybe I'm just missing something obvious on there, but it just seemed to be a continual problem, particularly if you're in teams where you're wanting to have multiple people doing the deployments each time as well. Okay, we've got a question here from Dev. So how does the SharePoint list connection get updated for different environment deployments using the pipeline deployment? If you were to do this from a DevOps pipeline, you'd use something called a settings file to try and get this updated, or to try and select the correct connection each time. And we're going to return and look at that, what those are, in a short while. So we'll return to that shortly. Okay, so the bad when it comes to Logic Apps then. So it's not a citizen developer tool, pure and simple. So you're going to need to have some experience working with, JSON documents. You're going to need to have a good, if not excellent appreciation when it comes to how Azure works from a templating standpoint. You need to know how to use and work with resource manager templates, particularly if you're wanting to do things like parameterization, and more advanced capabilities that way. Logic Apps, as we mentioned already, don't have our Dataverse current environment connector. So we have to give some thought and consideration to how we're going to parameterize and ensure that we're using the correct Dataverse environment each time. And typically what I find when it comes to our Logic Apps is that you do need to spend quite a bit of time preparing the templates. And there'll be a lot of parameterization and variables that we'll need to implement as part of that. I will see an example of this in a short while with a test Logic App that I've got set up, what you need to do to get it working, how you need it to. Okay, and then the ugly then. So the common thing that you typically find with Azure is that there's all manner of different errors that can potentially flare up as part of any deployment or any template deployment that we do. So it can sometimes be a case of, okay, we've missed a comma here, or we just need to update the API version. But sometimes the errors can lead you down some pretty sort of large rabbit holes, and you end up spending a whole day just trying to resolve something. Something which should just work. So that's one of the difficulties that we find with this, is that you go off into all sorts of different sort of rooms of Azure and finding out all sorts of interesting things in the process. The only problem with that is it takes you 2 days to fix the problem. And also the JSON templates as well. So that, for maybe just a single Logic App we're pushing out, okay, well, maybe our particular template isn't going to look too bad. If it's maybe just a very simple Logic App with a couple of action steps, then it should be fine. If our Logic App is what we term, or what I like to term, a spaghetti Logic App, where it's doing literally, hundreds and loads of different actions, lots of different conditions, scopes, and all sorts of stuff like that, then what you end up with is a really nice sort of, well, not nice, but a really huge document that's thousands of lines of code that you're having to sort of go through and having to figure out what's going on. And if you're looking to group together all of the logic apps as part of a single template, then again, that problem is only going to get worse over time. So, potentially quite difficult to actually understand and sort of work with those over time when you think, with our JSON templates. So David's got a great question here. So how would you compare them from a failure recovery or if problems are encountered in terms of the functionality of them? So I suppose because you've got our flows can be stored in solutions, because our logic apps can be stored in templates. From a disaster recovery standpoint, then they are, in theory, should be able to be restored very quickly. I would probably say that if you're going down the manual route with our flows, then again, you can probably restore very quickly. And because our both our cloud flows and our logic apps are effectively sort of stateless, it should be fairly quick and easy to restore them in both sorts of scenarios. So I probably would say they're on a par, perhaps, when it comes to that. Okay, got a question here from Julian. Which product should we consider if we want to perform a bulk update into batches for a large data set of around 100K records on the context entity in Dataverse? In Power Automate, we will be highly likely to hit the service protection API limit, and some of the updates will be failed. Well, regardless of what, any tool that we're using is going to be going through the web API. So if we're using Power Automate or Logic Apps, we're going to be having that same issue occur each time. So it's, when you couldn't really sort of recommend one product over the other there in that particular regard. That is a Dataverse limitation that you would want to that you would need to circumnavigate around. What you would need to potentially look at doing in either tool is consider perhaps having some throttling built into your particular tool. So when you know that you're potentially going to be falling foul of some kind of a service protection limit, making sure that you capture the appropriate error code that Microsoft returned to you, and then waiting for the appropriate amount of time to then recontinue the operation. So really, it doesn't matter which product you use as part of that. It really just boils down to how you sort of configure and write your flow. So if you check the documentation, you'll see that the exact status code, the exact properties that Microsoft return if you breach the service protection limit. And as part of that, you can then check I forget the property name, but it's a value that then tells you, okay, how long you need to wait before you can then make a request again. Then you just wait in the flow and then resume from there. In terms of the functionality from a sort of DR standpoint, i.e. one of the steps keeps failing for all occurrences on runs, for example, a broken dependency, what can you do? Like rerunning once the dependency is back up and running. Well, certainly with your logic apps, you've got a slightly longer history, as we talked about. So if you've got you need to maybe rerun something for more than 30 days, then perhaps you've got more logic app will be better, because you can restore that a bit sort of longer. Both our cloud flows and our logic apps support the ability to rerun any previous action fairly straightforwardly, and the experience there is broadly similar. So I'd probably say they're on a par. If for example, maybe overnight you've had 5 failures, regardless of which tool you're using, you should be able to go in and very easily rerun those 5 failures. Once you fix maybe the underlying issue in your API or endpoint or something like that. Okay, let's jump into a demo then and just look at some of this in a bit more detail then. So we're going to jump across into the Maker portal. So I've got my environment set up over here, and what I've got is a solution that I've put together using a Power Automate flow, and it's nothing really to sort of shout or write home about. What we've got in here is just a single flow, my appropriately named demo flow. This flow has a couple of connection references linked to it, one for Azure Blob Storage and one for Dataverse, and then a couple of environment variables that are then used to power the flow. And all the flow is doing is just whenever a new account row is added into Dataverse, it's going to go off into my Azure storage account and basically just create a new JSON document in there. So a fairly straightforward flow. What we're able to do as part of the flow, which is quite nice, is, as we mentioned, we can bring in our different environment variable values very easily. So I can just select anywhere on the inputs down here, and we can see there are the 3 different environment variables in my solution. And in this case, we've got access to broadly the same set of actions. The only difference here is that we can use the current environment connector to deploy out to sort of run our flow. Whereas if it was our Logic app, we would instead need to look at using the legacy Dataverse connector instead. So if we're wanting to look at maybe doing some automation around this, look to maybe run this via DevOps, the first thing we need to do is actually get this into source control. So I'm going to open up my Visual Studio Code window over here. What I've got at the top up here is an existing project that I've got set up and a folder where I store my flow solution. Using the pack CLI commands, I can very quickly and easily extract out or export my solution from my environment. So on the terminal down here, I can just run the following command down here, pack solution export, to download my flow solution. So hit the return button. It's going to connect up to my environment, export out that solution for me in managed. And then from here, we can then proceed to the next step, which will be to expand out the underlying contents. That's all been completed. Rather conveniently, as part of the pack CLI, I can also do an unpack of the solution and then have all the content stored down here. So I'm just going to do that now. Oh, there's a slight mistake there in the command. This needs to be true instead. So let me just fix that. Okay, so it's completely unpacked the solution into this folder over here. There's been no changes made at all, so it's nothing new to show on there. What we notice is that, as we mentioned earlier, our cloud flows are exported out into sort of a JSON document. We can maybe just format that quickly and have a quick look at how it all sort of looks. So again, this is broadly resembles what we would see when it comes to a Logic App template, although there are some important differences, as we'll note in a few moments. We can see as well we've got our various different environment variables and other components as well, which are saved down. So as a next step now, if I'm wanting to look at do some automation through via sort of Azure DevOps, I will need to look at generating a settings file for my solution. And this settings file defines the various values that we want to populate for not only our environment variables, but also for our connections as well. So again, I can use the pack CLI to generate my my settings file for me. So it's pack solution create settings down here. Hit return. After a few moments, we can see that it's now updated the document down here. And what we've got on here is basically just all of the different environment variables where we can specify a value for each of those. And then each of the connection references where we can again specify the values that we want to populate for our deployment. So let's look to proceed to the next step. Let's look to actually deploy this out into a different environment. So the first thing we would need to do is actually go across into Azure DevOps. We can see down here that we've got the settings file saved within our DevOps repo. We've got some current values defined for each of the different environment variables that we're working with. And then down here for our connection references, what we need to supply in order for it to know which connection to use is the connection ID that we've got already set up within our environment that we're importing into. So to obtain this, what we need to do is go into the environment that we're going to be importing into. So this GeoGriffin environment up here is where we're going to import. I just need to navigate onto the appropriate connections. So Azure Blob Storage, first of all. We can see at the top in the browser the ID number that we need. So we can just copy and paste that like so. Let's edit this document. Paste in the connection ID like so, and then do the same again for our Dataverse connector, or connection, I should say. So again, just grab that from the URL like so, paste that into there, commit that. And then what we can do, we've got a pipeline that we've got set up over here that can generate us a release artifact. Let's just run that now and give it a few moments just to complete. Whilst we're waiting, we're going to return to Visual Studio Code and we're going to look at a similar kind of flow that we've got set up over here, or similar sort of Logic App setup that we've got that does the exact same thing that we saw with our with the flow a few moments ago. And what we're going to do is we're just going to deploy this out and just talk about some of the things that we've been able to do here to ensure that everything works very nicely. So to deploy this out, what we need to do is make sure that we've connected up to Microsoft Azure. So we're going to do connect AZ account like so. I just need to generate the token like so, minimize that. It's going to find me my subscription after a few moments. Okay, and then now I can run a command down here to deploy this out into an existing resource group using the template file and a parameter file that I've got defined on here. So whilst that's running, all this template file contains up here is just a single logic app, which has broadly the same structure as the flow that we saw before with some important differences. And then as part of this template, we've got a few different sort of connections defined. And what we're able to do as part of this logic app, in comparison to our Cloudflow, is that we're able to use a client secret to be able to authenticate into Dataverse, and then also a managed identity for the storage account that we want to connect up to. What we're also able to do, which is quite nice, is actually also grant the logic app the appropriate permissions to access the storage account as part of the same deployment. So we can then ensure that everything works very nicely at the back end. So that deployment is finished. So if I navigate out into Azure, give this a quick refresh like so, we should see we've got a new logic app over here. And this logic app is effectively good to go. It's got everything it needs to start executing for the first time. The only main difference we can see on here is we've got a slightly different connector up here. We've got a legacy connector that we're using instead of the current environment one. But otherwise, the steps are broadly the same. We're able to use parameters in a very similar way, and we can define those in our template file. And we can also then go off and create our new blob storage, our blob item, our new JSON file very easily as well. So we'll give this logic app a test in a moment and just see how it all works very nicely straight away after the deployment. But what we now need to do, because we've got the pipeline finished executing up here, we can now create a brand new release at the top up here. So we're going to deploy out the flow into a new environment. So let's just check and make sure we got the correct date on that one. Hit the create button, and then that should take a few moments just to deploy out into our new environment. And we'll go in and observe how it looks in a few moments. Return now to our logic app over here. Let's give this a quick sort of test. Let's go into our Dataverse environments linked to this. All we've got in here is a very simple Canvas app that allows us to create a new account record. Let's give that a moment just to load up, and hoping and praying, as always, to the demo gods that they're going to be kind on me. Okay, so we're just going to go in and create a new account. So let's just call this maybe Contoso Limited. Nice new account for Contoso. Some numbers over here, ABC 1, 2, 3, 4. Save that like so. So a new account has been created. If we now go across to our logic app, we should hopefully be able to see a new execution after a few moments. Might be that we just need to run the trigger manually. Let's just do that. Yep, so there we go. So we can see it's been able to go off and run that successfully. It's all fully authenticated to not only our Dataverse environment, but also to our blob storage location. If I was to go into the blob location in question, we should be able to see a brand new file in here, which will be called after the name of the account. So in this case, Contoso Limited. So if I navigate through now, go into the blob storage, we can see that we should have Contoso Limited saved there. So with the logic app, what we've been able to achieve is we've been able to parameterize everything really nicely. It's all been able to work straight away. We've not really had to take any manual steps to get this activated and working. We're able to use parameters throughout this to be able to change how our particular sort of logic app behaves based on values that we specify at runtime. And certainly, no manual interference has been required in order to get this all working as how we want it to. In comparison to our flows, so we can see in DevOps this has now been completed successfully. So the thing that we've been able to do as part of this, just going back to what we spoke about earlier with our settings file. Oops, no, let me just edit the pipeline instead. So the same settings file we've used earlier, what we've been able to do is we've been able to tick this option as part of our deployment over here, and then we'll be able to link up the settings file. And then what that should then do during the deployment, it will then use the current values that we specify, and it should link up our connection references to our connections. So let's go in and inspect the solution within our this environment over here, which is where we deployed it out into. So you can see there's the new flow solution, like so. So you can see it's been able to import in the environment variables just fine. We can see there's the values as we saw on DevOps earlier. But the main problem we've got here, as we can see, is that the flow at the moment is currently switched off. So if we were to navigate into it like so, we can try to maybe switch it on, but I think we will have a potential problem with it. Let's just see. Okay, so it could be that we've got a potentially invalid environment variable on there. So that might explain why it's not switched on perhaps. But what we've been able to do in this case is to be able to link up to the connection references, okay? But the reason why it's been able to sort of do that is because we've had to go into the environment first of all and actually create the connections first of all. We've not been able to automate that particular step. So what we would need to do before any particular deployment is go into connections over here. We'd have to select the new connection button at the top like so, and then create all of this from scratch. So potentially, depending on how many flows we're deploying out, depending on how many connections we need to make, it could be that maybe this is potentially quite an onerous thing that we have to do each time. And again, potentially for situations where if we've got maybe different users deploying, again, we could see potential problems emerge there. Okay, then, so that wraps it up pretty much for the demonstration then. So hopefully you'll be able to see there how we can look to automate both a Cloudflow and a Logic App deployment and be able to observe the different things that we need to potentially consider and work with as part of each one. So I'm just going to return to the slides very quickly, and then we'll have time just to maybe go through some questions. So these are my sort of high-level thoughts then, based on, okay, which one should you actually use? Which one is going to be best based on your particular needs? What I would say is that maybe the specific scenario that we're working towards, will impact very heavily in terms of what option is going to be best. If you're going to be in a situation where you do manual deployments and maybe it's a very small project, then maybe Cloudflows could perhaps serve you quite well. When it comes to maybe more complex projects where we need that really nice automation end to end, then a Logic App could be a more appropriate choice for us to look at. The ALM story with Power Platform, there are potentially some rough edges at the moment, but it is something that will improve over time. It is something that Microsoft are actively investing in, so things are only going to get better over time. So for example, the fact that eventually we're going to have full support for key vaults, and when that becomes generally available, be able to link to key vault secrets. That's a really, really huge and significant thing that we've got and we can start to leverage. What I would say that there is perhaps always maybe a focus towards doing 100% automation where possible, and we tend to get quite obsessed with that particular idea. What I would say is that maybe it's more of a 95 or maybe a 99% goal. It's going to be impossible to fully automate all things. We should always expect there's going to need to be maybe some manual intervention that we need to do. If we can at least get 90-95% of the way there as part of whatever solution we adopt, then that will then I would probably say we've done a good job there. And finally, we should be, and the reason why we're using the Power Platform in the first place is that we've got these rich native capabilities available to us that we can leverage, and we encourage as much as possible to use those. So certainly when it comes from an ALM standpoint, we should be, for example, using things like the Power Platform build tools. We shouldn't be having to go off and write lots of custom code to do our deployments. Use what we've got there, and and hopefully we'll have a better time, and hopefully we'll be able to get to our end destination a lot faster as well. Okay, so that wraps it up then for the session then. So I hope you found what we talked about useful, and some of the different thoughts and considerations that sort of came out of it. I'm happy you've got about just under or just over maybe 5 minutes for questions maybe. I'm just checking the chat now to see if we had any new questions in. Okay, so we've got a question here from Davey N. So how did you create the flow deployment file and what does it contain? Okay, so if I just show you again very quickly on that one. So to create the flow deployment file, I ran the following command here. So pack solution create settings. And as part of that, I fed in two different sort of values. I fed in the path to the expanded solution folder down here. And then from there, it's going to go in and look at our solution.xml. And then I've also then specified the name of the settings file and where I want it to be saved. When I run that command, the end result will then be a file similar to what we can see down here. This will contain all of our environment variables and then all of our connection references. The only key bit that's missing from each of these is the value and then the connection IDs as well. We need to supply those and give those, and then from there we can then look to leverage this as part of a deployment pipeline. So I hope that's answered your question just there. And yes, I'd agree with Phil as well that the ALM accelerator, that is a fairly new thing. I think as we saw as part of the previous session, it's got a really nice capabilities as part of that. So we should try and use that where possible, and it can try and remove some of these headaches where possible. Okay, and an interesting comment from Nicole. So actually, sounds like I've turned Nicole completely against Cloudflows and I've affirmed his belief in Logic Apps. Okay, yeah, as I say, that I generally find with Logic Apps that you can go a bit further in terms of parameterizing, and they've got some nicer sort of bells and whistles. So the fact that we can use manage identities is really great. It means that we're not having to mess around with credentials and things like that. So there are definitely some tempting things with Logic Apps. But the caveat with it is that okay, if we've maybe not got people in the organization who are Pro or Fusion developers, it's going to be a lot more challenging for us to engage with that tool potentially. So it swings and roundabouts. It's like with anything, any tool. There's pros and cons either way, I guess. All right, okay. So I can't see any more questions in the chat. So again, thank you for attending the session today. I hope you found it very useful. Feel free to connect with me after today. My LinkedIn and Twitter details on there. Always happy to chat about anything to do with Power Platform or Azure. And I guess I'll hand over back to David now, the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Joe. Really excellent presentation. Thanks for doing that. Bear with me 2 seconds while I just stop the recording and restart the new one.